Close your eyes and imagine this. You're torn from your homeland, shackled in iron, and dragged into a market where strangers shout prices for your body. From that moment, you're no longer a person, you're property. This was the reality of ancient Rome, a civilization that dazzled the world with its power, yet built its empire on the suffering of millions who had no choice but to serve. How people became slaves. In Rome, slavery wasn't rare, it was everywhere. It wasn't an exception, it was the foundation of society itself. The most common path into chains was war. Rome was always at war. Gaul, Carthage, Greece, Britain. Every conquest delivered new prisoners, soldiers defeated, civilians uprooted, entire villages swallowed by Rome's hunger. After the parade celebrating victory, these captives were sold like spoils of war, their futures decided under the hammer of the auctioneer. Debt could also doom you. A citizen who couldn't pay what he owed could be forced into nexame debt slavery. Whole families sold to work off obligations that might never truly disappear. Others were simply born with chains. A child born to a slave mother belonged to the master, never tasting freedom from the first breath of life. Pirates added to the supply, raiding coastlines and ships across the Mediterranean. Port cities like Delos and Carthage became infamous markets where human lives were traded in the thousands. Sometimes, poverty itself drove free people to surrender their liberty in exchange for food and shelter. Others were abandoned at birth, infants left on trash heaps, collected by traders, and raised only to be sold. And unlike later centuries, Roman slavery wasn't about race. It spanned every ethnicity: Germans, Egyptians, Greeks, Syrians, Africans, Gauls. To the Romans, it didn't matter where you came from, only what you could do and how long your body could endure. Your first day in slavery being purchased marked the end of your old life. At the market, buyers examined you as if you were livestock. They squeezed muscles, pried open mouths to check teeth, studied scars to judge strength or rebellion. A strong man might be sent to the fields, a young woman might be destined for the household, or far worse. Once chosen, you began the journey to a new master. Chained to strangers, shoved into wagons, or marched on foot, you never knew where you were going. You had no right to ask. The first things taken were your identity and your dignity. Your name was erased, replaced by something meaningless. Felix, Lucky, Secundus, Second, empty words that mocked who you used to be. Many were branded with hot irons, a mark of ownership burned into their flesh. Your first meal was little more than scraps, just enough to keep you alive. Your first bed, a cold floor, a corner in a storeroom, or a place next to animals. Comfort was a privilege for the few, never for the new. If your fate was hard labor, there was no transition period, no training. You were shoved straight into fields, mines, and quarries where chains and whips became your constant companions. Others trained as household servants, tutors, or caretakers, but even there, the fear of punishment never loosened its grip. What hurt most was not just the body but the soul. Families were torn apart, pasts were erased, futures stolen. On that first night, lying on cold stone, the truth sank in. This wasn't a temporary nightmare. This was life now, and it might never end. A fragile chance at freedom, and yet, in rare moments, light broke through the darkness. Rome's system allowed a small number of slaves to escape their fate. One path was manumission, a master granting freedom. Some freed loyal servants as rewards, others in their wills after death. A few ceremonies were public, with names recorded in law, granting undeniable freedom. Another path was through money. Skilled slaves or doctors, scribes, teachers, craftsmen were sometimes allowed to keep a small share of earnings called peculium. If they saved enough, they could buy their freedom, rare, but not impossible. Educated slaves often lived in a strange in-between world, still bound, but granted more respect. Some managed estates, ran businesses, even lived in private houses with allowances. Still, their cage was only wider, not broken. Once freed, they became libertini, freedmen. They could marry, own property, raise children. And if those children were born free, they inherited full Roman citizenship. In some cases, freed slaves even became wealthy, using knowledge gained in bondage to build fortunes. But make no mistake, these were exceptions. For most, freedom was a dream, whispered in secret. A hope that gave just enough strength to keep breathing. Attitudes toward slaves. Romans didn't see slaves as people. They had a chilling term, instrumentum vocale, a tool that speaks. Even modest households often owned one or two. The wealthy owned hundreds, entire armies of cooks, guards, scribes, entertainers, and concubines. Some slaves existed solely to remind their master when it was time to bathe. Law offered no protection. A master could execute a slave on a whim. Slaves could be tortured for testimony in court. If one killed their master, every slave in that household could be executed, guilty or not. That's exactly what happened in 61 CE, when Senator Petunius Secundus was killed. 400 slaves and men, women, even children, were slaughtered in revenge. Even freed slaves never fully escaped the stigma. They could never hold high office. Their past remained a stain. Rome never let them wash away love, sex, and children. For slaves, even the most intimate parts of life weren't theirs to control. Romantic relationships existed, but they were always fragile. Lovers could be separated, sold, or punished for daring to care. Children born to slaves were automatically slaves, property from birth, regardless of who the father was. Masters sometimes encouraged pregnancies, not out of compassion, but profit. A child was an investment, another body to exploit. And rape, it was constant, and it was legal. Slave women had no right to refuse. Many masters kept concubines from among their slaves, showering them with gifts, but never erasing the reality: consent didn't exist. If a noble woman dared a relationship with a slave, the punishment was swift and brutal. For the slave, death; for the woman, disgrace. Some infants born of such unions were abandoned, erased from history before they could draw breath. Rebellions and dreams of freedom. You can shackle bodies, but you cannot shackle dreams. Despite the risks, rebellions sometimes erupted. The most famous came in 73 BCE, when Spartacus, a gladiator from Thrace, escaped captivity with a band of fellow fighters. What began as a desperate flight turned into a war. Thousands of slaves joined him, men and women who Rome considered nothing more than tools. They crushed legions, raided camps, and for a moment, terrified the empire that had once seemed untouchable. But Rome's might was relentless. The general Marcus Crassus crushed the revolt. Spartacus fell in battle. His body never recovered. 6,000 survivors were crucified along the Appian Way, a horrific monument of warning stretching for miles. And yet, the dream didn't die. Other uprisings flickered in Sicily, in distant provinces, in whispered plans by firesides. Even when crushed, they proved one truth: the human spirit always longs for freedom. For those who couldn't rebel, resistance was quieter, work slowed, tasks sabotaged. Some slipped away into forests, mountains, or barbarian tribes. Few survived. Runaways were hunted, tortured, and executed as living warnings. Still, the attempt itself carried meaning. The death of a slave, for most, slavery ended only in death. The body broke under endless labor, in fields, quarries, mines, and workshops. Accidents, disease, whips, hunger. Few lived to grow old. And when they did, old age was no mercy. The worn-out were thrown into the streets, abandoned to starve. Rome had a name for it: relegatio servorum vetulorum, the banishment of the useless. Others were sold cheap into mines or galleys, where survival was measured in weeks. Some were executed in punishment. Others killed for entertainment, fighting in arenas, devoured by beasts, slaughtered for the amusement of crowds. Death offered no dignity. Burials were rare. Most were burned without names or tossed into mass graves with refuse. Only the fortunate few were remembered on stone, their epitaphs short and haunting. Secundus, slave of Lucius, loyal, honest, died at 40. For the vast majority, nothing remained. No name, no grave, no memory. And yet, their suffering did not vanish completely. The glory of Rome, its marble, its laws, its empire, was built on their broken backs, their silent endurance. Slaves weren't simply laborers, they were the foundation. Invisible, unthanked, erased, yet essential. The Roman Empire stood because millions who had no voice carried its weight. The life of a slave in ancient Rome was not a life at all. It was survival, one day at a time, one breath at a time. Their stories rarely survived in records, but without them, Rome would never have risen. If you found this story haunting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold chapters of history. Because the past isn't only about emperors and generals, it's about the forgotten voices that built civilizations and paid the highest price.